Hello, I'm Christian Jabes. Welcome to my Neuromatch flash talk on unsupervised learning of contour grouping in a recurrent neural network cell. So nowadays, deep neural networks are quite popular as machine vision models and as models of biological vision. However, we also know that they have some problems. For example, they're mostly biased towards local patches, local textures, not so much to global perception of object shape. So if you take an image like this, scramble it up, the network will still classify this as birch tree and not really perceive that there's anything wrong with it. So we know that in primate vision, in the primate visual system, perceptual grouping is mediated by lateral connections within cortical areas. So a natural question is whether such lateral grouping can be used to improve deep neural networks. To this purpose, we propose a novel RNN cell, which is based on models of grouping in visual cortex. So basically it gets an input here. There's some pre-filtering, for example, here for horizontal orientation contrast. And this now drives our recurrent cell, which has excitatory connections over a relatively large area. These are here shown in green. And the idea is that these can basically collect activation. So for example, here of this horizontal contour, and then group this horizontal contour and, for example, complete gaps in there. And in order to prevent this lateral excitation to create runaway activation, we have an inhibitory kernel here in red that balances this excitation. Then the output of our recurrent cells is normalized and then modulates the overall network output. So the kernels that are shown here are basically taken from previous modeling work. They are not learned, but basically if you know that your input filter takes horizontal orientations, you can theoretically specify what kind of grouping you want. Of course, in a network with learned filters, you need to learn your grouping as well. So the question is, how do we learn our grouping kernels? One possibility would be to use supervised learning. However, that requires labeled training data, and those aren't really available for grouping tasks in natural images. This has been mainly done on simple artificial image domains. Also, since we are based our recurrent cell on a neuron model, we'd have to backpropagate through neuron dynamics, which is possible but expensive computationally. So instead, a better possibility is to use unsupervised learning. It has been shown on simple images, grayscale images with rectangles, that this can learn perceptual grouping kernels. However, we want to do this basically on any image domain or natural images that you use neural networks on. So here we use the same kind of principle, stabilized Hebbian learning, the in-star-out-star rule, but we make adjustments to be able to use this with separable convolutions and to improve performance. And now we basically should be able to incorporate this into a deep network with learned input filters. However, first of all, we want to know whether this actually does learn useful perceptual grouping. So for that, we compare it to some other architectures. First of all, a no grouping architecture, which just performs the input filtering and no grouping cell. Then an untrained architecture, which has the grouping cell, but the excitatory and inhibitory kernel are just randomly initialized and not trained. Then our architecture of interest, the grouping architecture, which now learns the excitatory and inhibitory kernel. So we don't know what will come out of here, but we want to know whether this can then perform perceptual grouping. And finally, we also compare this to the fixed pre-specified weights from previous modeling work. And we do this on two image domains. First of all, grayscale images of rectangles with some noise on top, and then the BSD 500 dataset, natural images for which human labelers basically have labeled the object boundaries. Of course, the object boundaries are salient contours in the image, but not the only ones. So there are also some contours in here that aren't labeled. But of course, this should give us, basically, these labels should still tell us whether contours are enhanced overall. Okay, so we put these images through edge filters. These are pre-specified, not learned in this case, since we want to be able to compare to the pre-specified theoretical grouping kernels. And we put these through our different grouping architectures. And then we compare basically to these labeled contours. We compute two metrics. First of all, the contour saliency, which quantifies whether our labeled contours here, basically the network responses at these labeled locations, whether these network responses get enhanced by grouping. And second, orientation significance, whether at these contour locations the sharpness of orientation tuning is increased. So if we look first of all at the rectangle images, this is the distribution for the no grouping architecture. Each dot here corresponds to one image in the test data set. And here is then the untrained grouping architecture. As you can see, there is a tiny shift here, but not so much of an improvement. Now, if we use our learned grouping filters, the difference is a lot bigger, and so actually the saliency of these contours here is enhanced. However, the fixed pre-specified filters from previous modeling work perform even better on this data set. On natural images, the situation is less clear. So you can see that there is considerable spread. There are quite a few outliers, but the overall tendency is that the untrained network does not improve the contour saliency. The trained grouping does improve it a bit, and even more than the fixed weights, but yeah, the differences are less clear. On the natural images, we can also look at the orientation significance. And there we see a similar trend as here with the contour saliency, that the grouping improves the orientation significance, but not as much as the fixed pre-specified filters. Okay, and here are some image examples. So this is the input image. This is the output of the edge filtering, taking the maximum overall orientations at each location. And here is then the RNN output. And as you can see, several of the important contours in the image are enhanced. And here are the ground truth object boundary labels. Okay, so in summary, we proposed a novel RNN cell for perceptual grouping. This uses unsupervised learning, so we don't need labels, we should be able to just use this on natural images in a deep network. And this enhances contours and object boundaries. And now the next steps are, of course, to incorporate this in a deep network, train it with supervised learning, and incorporate this unsupervised grouping, and investigate whether this alleviates texture bias and improves robustness. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions in the Discord chat. Also, watch out for a preprint, which should be coming.